Frozen Blood on the Laramie Trail, Captive Cheyenne Woman, and Bounty Hunter 1883 Wyoming. A long time ago, in the cold and unforgiving lands of Wyoming, a young Cheyenne woman named etched lived a life of freedom. The Cheyenne were a proud people, known for their strength, courage, and close connection to the land. They had long roamed the Great Plains of North America, hunting buffalo and living in harmony with nature. Etched had grown up in a small, tight-knit tribe, surrounded by her family and friends. Her world was one of beauty, with wide-open skies, endless fields of grass, and the sound of the river flowing nearby. It was a world she loved and cherished. But that world was changing. The settlers had been moving westward, pushing the native tribes out of their traditional lands. The U.S. government, in an effort to expand its territories, had sent soldiers to force the Cheyenne and other tribes onto reservations. For years, there had been constant conflict, with both sides suffering losses. The Cheyenne had tried to hold on to their land and their way of life, but the pressure was too great. One day, while etched was in her village, everything she knew was turned upside down. The sun had barely risen that morning when a group of soldiers rode into their camp, guns raised. The attack came without warning, and in the chaos that followed, etched was captured. She had been part of a raid, but as the soldiers closed in, she was overwhelmed. There were too many of them, and too little time to escape. Her people fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The soldiers rounded up the survivors, and etched was one of them. She was tied up and led away from her home, her heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. Her tribe, her family, everything she loved was now behind her. The journey ahead was uncertain, and fear gnawed at her insides. As she was dragged through the wilderness, bound and helpless, etched tried to hold on to the hope that somehow she would find a way to escape. The world seemed so vast and lonely. The sun beat down on her, but the cold wind bit into her skin. She was far from home, and every step seemed to take her further away from everything she had ever known. Her captors were ruthless. They showed no mercy as they pushed her forward, their eyes cold and indifferent. Etched had never experienced such cruelty before. She was used to the challenges of the wild, but the brutality of the soldiers made everything seem so much harder. They treated her like an object, a prize to be won, rather than a human being. Every night, they tied her to a tree or a post and left her there, cold and alone. There was no kindness, no sympathy. She was just another prisoner to be dragged along the trail. But etched was no ordinary prisoner. She had been raised by strong women, taught to be brave and resilient. Her mother had often told her that the Cheyenne people were survivors, that no matter what happened, they would never give up. Strength lies in your heart, her mother had said. When the world turns against you, that is when you must stand tall. Etched clung to those words as she walked in silence, her hands bound, her feet sore. The journey was long, and every day seemed to stretch on forever. But as the days passed, she grew stronger. She had been through hardships before, times when food was scarce, when the weather was harsh, and when the tribe had been forced to move. This was different, though. She was no longer with her people, no longer surrounded by the warmth of family. The soldiers didn't care about her suffering. They didn't notice the fire burning in her eyes. She wasn't just a captive to them. She was a reminder of everything they were trying to break. Every step they took toward the fort was a reminder of how much had been lost, how much they were stealing from her and her people. But etched knew that as long as she had breath, she would fight. She would never let them take her spirit. At night, as the soldiers built their campfires and sat around them, etched would listen to the wind whispering through the trees. She imagined herself back at her village, sitting with her family by the fire, hearing the stories of her ancestors. She closed her eyes and pictured the vast plains stretching out before her, the buffalo grazing peacefully in the distance. Her people had lived in harmony with the land for generations. How could she let it all slip away so easily? But she was not alone in this journey. Her captors may have treated her like an animal, but she was determined to prove that she was far more than that. As the days passed, she started to observe the soldiers. They were not invincible. They were not perfect. They had their own fears, their own doubts. One of the soldiers, a younger man, seemed different from the rest. He wasn't as cold or cruel as the others. He often looked away when she caught his gaze, and sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he seemed to hesitate. Etched couldn't tell if he felt sorry for her or if he was just unsure of what he was doing. Either way, she began to form a plan. She wasn't foolish. She knew that escape would be difficult, if not impossible, but she also knew that she couldn't sit back and do nothing. She had been taught to be resourceful, to use whatever she could to survive. Every moment, every decision mattered. One night, when the soldiers were busy with their campfire, etched saw her chance. She managed to free one of her hands, slipping the ropes that bound her. With her heart racing, she stood up silently, making sure not to alert anyone. The stars above seemed to offer her encouragement, the cool breeze brushing against her face as she moved stealthily toward the edge of the camp. Her escape was within reach. But as she took that first step into the night, something stopped her. The weight of her situation settled in once more. The soldiers would not give up easily. They would hunt her down. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face that challenge, but she also knew that staying in captivity meant certain death. She had to try. In the darkness, she took a deep breath, her body trembling but her spirit unwavering. She was ready to fight for her freedom. She wasn't just running from her captors. She was running toward a future where she could still be free. Her journey was far from over, but as long as she could hold on to hope, she knew that one day she would find a way back to her people, back to the land she loved. Will Graves, a seasoned bounty hunter, was a man of few words and many scars. His life had been spent chasing down criminals, bringing them to justice, and surviving the brutal wilderness of the American frontier. He had seen the darkness in people, the desperation that led men to do terrible things. He didn't care much for the reasons behind the jobs he took. He just did them because it was all he knew. He had no love for the law or the land he worked on. He only worked for the money. In a world where survival was often the only goal, Will had become a man who felt little. Graves had been hired by the U.S. government to track down and capture members of the Cheyenne tribe who had been involved in raids on settler camps. It was a job that paid well, but it was also dangerous and relentless. It meant chasing down men, women, and children, bringing them back to the government's fort, where they would be put into captivity, or worse. Will didn't question the morality of his work. It was just the way things were in the wild, a place where right and wrong didn't always matter. What mattered was getting the job done. He had spent the last several weeks tracking a group of Cheyenne warriors who had been raiding the area. His search had brought him deep into the Wyoming wilderness, where the land was harsh and the weather was unpredictable. Will had learned to read the land like an open book, using every sign, every clue to guide him forward. His horse was a trusted companion, and his rifle a tool of survival. Will never liked to waste time. He moved quickly, efficiently, never allowing himself to be distracted by anything that wasn't directly related to his work. It was a cold morning when he finally spotted the group of Cheyenne. They had made camp beside a frozen river, their fire barely visible in the early light. Will had seen their smoke trails and knew they weren't far off. His heart raced as he prepared for the capture, the familiar tension building inside him. He wasn't used to feelings, but today, something felt different. He pushed the thought aside. He'd been doing this too long to let emotions get in the way. As he approached the camp quietly, Will noticed something unusual. The Cheyenne warriors were nowhere to be seen. Instead, there was a woman, a young Cheyenne, sitting alone by the fire. Her head was bowed, and she seemed to be lost in thought. She was unguarded, unaware of the danger that was closing in. Will felt a flicker of hesitation, but it was fleeting. He had a job to do, and he couldn't let anything stop him. The woman was sitting on a blanket, her hands tied loosely in front of her. Will recognized her as one of the captives. She had been taken in one of the earlier raids, but he had never seen her before. She was younger than most of the women he had captured, with long dark hair that cascaded down her back. Her face was solemn, her eyes filled with the weariness of captivity. Despite the fear that must have been in her heart, there was something about her that struck Will. Her dignity, perhaps, or the quiet strength in her posture. He crept closer, his rifle ready. He had been trained to take down targets with precision, to handle each capture quickly and without hesitation. But as he looked at the woman, he couldn't help but feel something unfamiliar stir inside him. He had seen many prisoners over the years, but none like her. She wasn't begging for mercy, nor was she fighting back. She was simply waiting. But waiting for what? Will didn't know, and for a brief moment he wondered if he could understand her story. A sudden sound broke the silence, pulling Will from his thoughts. The rest of the Cheyenne warriors had returned. They rode back into the camp on horseback, their faces grim and tense. The moment had passed, and Will knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't afford to be caught in the open. Without a second thought, he dashed forward, his boots crunching in the snow as he made his way toward the woman. The warriors were distracted, too busy tending to their horses to notice him at first. Will grabbed the woman by the arm, pulling her to her feet with surprising strength. She looked up at him, her eyes widening in shock as she realized what was happening. But there was no panic, no frantic struggle. Instead, she stood still, her eyes holding his gaze for a long moment, as if searching him for some kind of answer. Will felt something shift within him, but he couldn't put a name to it. "Move," he ordered, his voice low and harsh. He pulled her toward his horse, his hand tight on her arm. She didn't resist, but she didn't make it easy either. Every step was calculated, as if she were preparing for something he couldn't see. Will could feel the weight of her stare on him, the quiet understanding between them, but he pushed it all aside. This was his job. He was a bounty hunter, and he had no place for feelings. As they reached his horse, Will swung her up into the saddle, his hand on her waist. He mounted behind her, his grip tight as he urged his horse forward. The wind whipped around them, the cold biting at their faces. But Will didn't slow down. He needed to get as far from the camp as possible before the warriors noticed what had happened. The ride was long, the only sounds being the rhythmic pounding of hooves in the snow and the occasional rustling of the woman's clothing. Will kept his eyes ahead, focused on the trail, but he could feel her presence next to him, like a shadow that refused to leave. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The silence between them stretched on, growing heavier with each passing mile. Will had grown used to silence over the years. It was easier that way. No one to talk to, no need to explain himself. His work was simple. Find the target, capture them, and collect the reward. There was no room for conversation or connection. But this woman, this Cheyenne captive, was different. He had always kept his distance from his prisoners, but with her, he couldn't help but wonder. Why had she not fought? Why had she surrendered so easily? As they rode through the cold wilderness, Will tried to ignore the questions that gnawed at him. He was a man who had learned to shut off everything that didn't serve his purpose. But something about this woman, about her quiet strength, made him question himself. He didn't know what it was, but he felt it. Something was changing. And he didn't know if it was for better or worse. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Will Graves and this Cheyenne woman were bound together now. Their fates tied by the wilderness they both had to navigate. Neither of them knew what the future held. But for now, they were traveling down the same path, driven by forces beyond their control. The journey had been long, and the cold was unrelenting. The winter in Wyoming was nothing short of brutal, with snowstorms sweeping in unexpectedly and the wind biting like sharp daggers against the skin. Will Graves, hardened by years of living in the wild, had learned to endure the harsh elements. But even he felt the sting of the cold as it gnawed at his bones. His horse, too, seemed to grow tired, its hooves sinking deeper into the snow with each step. Still, Will pressed forward, his mind focused on the task at hand. His captive, the Cheyenne woman, sat before him on the horse, her body stiff but her posture unbroken. He had been riding with her for days now, and though she had not spoken a word since the moment he had taken her, Will couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than what he had first thought. She was unlike the other prisoners he had encountered over the years. There was no begging, no pleading. She had simply accepted her fate, as if she knew something that Will didn't. It wasn't that Will didn't know how to handle prisoners. He had done it countless times before. He had captured men, women, and even children, all with the same cold detachment. But this woman, she was different. Her calmness unnerved him. Even in the face of captivity, she carried herself with a dignity that he had come to respect, though he had never admitted it to himself. They traveled through the snow-covered plains, the landscape stretching out endlessly before them. The wind howled as it swept across the frozen ground, pushing against them at every turn. The air was thin and sharp, and the only sounds were the rhythmic pounding of hooves on the snow and the occasional crackle of the fire they built each night. Will kept his eyes ahead, focusing on the trail, but there was something about the silence between him and his captive that made the ride feel different. It was almost as if the silence was filled with unspoken words, words that neither of them were ready to say. Each night they made camp in the freezing cold, huddled close to the fire to stay warm. Will didn't bother to tie her up anymore. He had learned that she wasn't going to try to escape. Not that she would have had the strength to do so in such conditions. The bonds between them, both physical and unspoken, were clear, though neither acknowledged them. She sat across the fire from him, her face half lit by the flickering flames, her dark eyes watching him from beneath the hood of her cloak. Will had never been one to show weakness, but something about her gaze made him uneasy. It was as though she could see through him, as though she understood something about him that even he hadn't fully realized yet. The days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next. Will didn't speak to her, and she didn't speak to him. But there were moments when he would catch her looking at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. It was a look that made him question his own actions. He had seen countless prisoners in his time, but none had ever looked at him this way. He wasn't sure if it was defiance or something else entirely, but it stirred something deep inside him, something he had long buried under layers of indifference. One evening, as the fire burned low and the temperature dropped even further, Will sat by the fire, staring into the flames. His thoughts drifted to his past, to the choices he had made that had led him to this life. He had never been a man of deep reflection, But something about this journey with the Cheyenne woman made him think about the life he had chosen. Was this really the path he wanted to continue down? Was he doing the right thing by capturing her? By bringing her to Fort Laramie like some kind of trophy? The woman sat across from him, her eyes flicking toward him for just a moment before returning to the fire. Will noticed how her face seemed to soften when she wasn't looking at him, as if she were lost in thought, too. He wondered what she was thinking. Did she hate him? Did she curse the day he had come into her life? Or did she see something more in him, something he couldn't quite understand? The silence stretched on, heavy and thick. Will was about to break it when he noticed a faint sound in the distance. He stood up quickly, scanning the dark horizon. The sound was faint at first, but then it grew louder. The unmistakable sound of hooves, galloping fast and hard. Will's instincts kicked in, his hand immediately going to the rifle at his side. He motioned for the woman to stay down and grabbed the reins of his horse, pulling it closer to the fire. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Will's heart raced as he prepared for whatever was coming. He could see the shadows of riders emerging from the snowstorm, their forms barely visible in the darkness. It wasn't long before he could make out their features. 3 men on horseback, each one dressed in the distinctive attire of settlers. They were clearly in a hurry, and as they approached, Will saw the fear in their eyes. "Bounty hunter!" one of the men called out, his voice strained. "We need help. The Cheyenne... They're attacking our camp." Will's heart sank as the men rode closer. The thought of more Cheyenne warriors on the warpath filled him with dread. But what unsettled him more was the way the men looked at him, as if expecting him to offer a solution to their problem. They weren't asking for help. They were demanding it. "What happened?" Will asked, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through him. "They've raided our camp," the man said breathlessly. "Taken our supplies, killed our cattle. They're heading west, and we're stuck here in the snow." "Please, you've got to help us. We're not armed, and we'll freeze out here if you don't." Will knew that his decision here would be crucial. He could join the men in their pursuit of the Cheyenne, track them down, and bring them to justice as he had done so many times before. But something held him back. The woman sitting by the fire, his captive, was one of the very people these men feared. Would he be helping them in the right way? Would it be right to hunt down more Cheyenne, to chase them across the wild? Or was it time for him to make a different kind of decision, one that could change everything for him and for her? The woman, sensing the tension, looked up from the fire, her eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze, something that spoke to him more than words ever could. Will knew he had a choice to make. The path ahead of him was unclear, and the stakes were higher than ever. The ride to Fort Laramie had started as a simple task, but now everything felt more complicated. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. The journey ahead would test him in ways he could never have imagined. The next few days passed in a quiet tension. Will Graves had taken his captive, the Cheyenne woman, further westward, away from the settlement and toward Fort Laramie. The weather had worsened, and the cold winds carried with them a biting sharpness that cut through their clothing and into their bones. The snow was relentless, falling in thick sheets, covering everything in a blanket of white. It was as if the land itself had turned against them, forcing them to endure its fury. Despite the harsh conditions, the silence between them remained. Will kept his distance, focused on the trail ahead, while the woman sat quietly in front of him on the horse, her posture strong, but her eyes distant. He didn't know what to make of her anymore. She had been calm since he had taken her, never once fighting or trying to escape. She hadn't asked for mercy, and she hadn't cursed him. She simply followed along, as if accepting the fate that had been forced upon her. It was almost as if she had given up on any hope of freedom. Will couldn't understand it. How could anyone accept such a fate? Each night they set up camp in the snow, huddling together for warmth by the fire. Will kept the fire burning high, knowing that without it they would be lost to the cold. The woman didn't speak, but her eyes would often wander to the flames, her gaze distant, as if lost in thought. It was a quiet sadness in her eyes, something that told Will she was far away, perhaps remembering a time when life was different, before it was shattered by the brutality of war and captivity. Will, for his part, had grown restless. He had been a bounty hunter for most of his life, and he had never once questioned his work. It was simple. Capture the target, bring them in, collect the reward. He had never cared much for the reasons behind it all. But something about this journey with her made him question the very life he had chosen. She wasn't just another prisoner, another task to be completed. There was something about her strength, her quiet resilience, that made him wonder if he had been wrong all along. One evening, as the fire crackled and the stars filled the sky above, Will couldn't take the silence anymore. He knew he couldn't stay silent, not when the questions were weighing so heavily on his mind. He turned toward her, his voice soft despite his usual gruffness. "Why don't you speak?" he asked. His words were careful, measured, as though he were testing the waters. "Why don't you fight back? You're not like the others. You've been quiet ever since I took you." She didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the fire, but also something deeper, something far away. Will had expected her to be angry, to demand freedom or curse him for what he had done. But instead, she simply sat there, her face calm, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady, like the wind in the trees, soft but powerful. "There is no fighting when the world is against you," she said. "What is there to fight? The path is already set." Will frowned, unsure of what she meant. Her words didn't make sense to him. She was a captive, a prisoner, and yet she spoke as if there were nothing to resist. It confused him, unsettled him. How could anyone accept that kind of fate? "Don't you want to be free?" Will asked, his voice almost a whisper, the question escaping before he could stop it. "You don't fight? You don't run? Why?" She met his gaze, and for the first time Will saw something in her eyes that made him pause. It wasn't fear, or anger, or even sadness. It was understanding, as if she knew something he didn't, something he wasn't ready to face. "Freedom isn't always what you think it is," she said. "Sometimes survival is more important. I've learned that in my life." Will didn't know how to respond. He had been chasing freedom all his life, always thinking that if he just did the next job, got the next reward, everything would be better. But this woman, this Cheyenne captive, was making him question everything he had ever known. She wasn't angry with him, nor was she begging for freedom. She had found a kind of peace in her own way, something that Will could not understand. It made him uncomfortable. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows on their faces. Will felt a strange shift in the air, a tension that wasn't just caused by the cold. It was something deeper, something that had been building since the moment he had laid eyes on her. He had never been one to get emotionally involved in his work, but this journey, this strange, uncomfortable silence, was beginning to change him in ways he couldn't explain. The next day, the weather worsened even further. The snow fell in thick layers, blanketing the world in a silent, icy fog. The trail became harder to follow, and the wind howled like a wild animal, tearing at their clothes and pushing them backward with every step. Will kept his head down, focused on the trail, but he could feel the weight of the woman's presence behind him, a constant reminder of the decisions he had made. They rode through the storm, the cold pressing in from all sides. The air was so cold that it burned his lungs with every breath. Will's horse struggled through the deepening snow, its hooves sinking lower with each step. The wind seemed to scream through the trees, and the snow was so thick that the world felt like it had been swallowed whole by the storm. As they continued, Will felt the familiar sting of doubt creeping in. He had always been a man who took what was given to him. Bounty hunting was his job, his life. But now, with every mile they traveled together, something was shifting inside him. He began to wonder if there was more to life than just surviving, more than just the next job or the next bounty. The Cheyenne woman had shown him a different way of thinking, one that he couldn't ignore. By the time they reached the edge of the plains, the storm was at its worst. The wind howled louder than ever, and the snow was so thick that it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Will had to squint just to keep his bearings. He pulled his horse to a stop, looking back at the woman. "We'll have to make camp here," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "It's too dangerous to move forward." She nodded, her face calm despite the fierce weather. She slid off the horse gracefully and started gathering firewood, her movements steady and practiced. Will watched her for a moment before dismounting, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling on his shoulders. They worked in silence, setting up camp and huddling close to the fire for warmth. As they sat together in the shelter of the fire, Will couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. Despite everything, the cold, the storm, the uncertainty, he felt something shift inside him. It was as if for the first time in a long while he could let go of the constant drive for survival and simply exist. He didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment he wasn't thinking about the next bounty or the next job. For once he was simply living, with the woman beside him, in a world that was no longer just about survival. And for the first time he wondered if that was enough. The days had started to blur together. The storm that had trapped them on the plains seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the cold had become a constant companion. Will Graves had spent years surviving in harsh conditions, but this winter was different. This journey, this strange, unexpected bond between him and the Cheyenne woman, was testing him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The questions that had started as whispers in his mind were now growing louder, harder to ignore. He had always been a man who followed orders, who did his job without hesitation, without asking too many questions. But now, with each passing day, the certainty that had once defined him was beginning to slip away. The woman, his captive, had shown him a side of the world he hadn't seen before, a side that didn't revolve around survival, bounty hunting, and chasing the next reward. There was something in her, something he couldn't quite put into words, that made him question everything he thought he knew. For the first time, Will was torn. He had always believed in the simplicity of his work. Find the target, capture them, and collect the reward. It was straightforward, and it kept him from feeling anything beyond the cold, hard reality of survival. But this journey, this woman, was making him feel more than he ever had before, and it was uncomfortable. The wind howled as they rode through the snow-covered landscape, the blizzard making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Will squinted into the storm, his hand gripping the reins tightly, his mind focused on the road ahead. The woman sat quietly in front of him, her eyes scanning the horizon. But her face was calm, as it always was. She had not spoken in days, not since their conversation around the fire. Will had asked her why she didn't fight, why she had accepted her fate, and she had answered him without anger, without fear. Her words had stayed with him, echoing in his mind. "Freedom isn't always what you think it is," she had said. "Sometimes survival is more important." Will didn't understand her completely, but there was truth in what she had said. He had been chasing freedom for as long as he could remember, but he had never stopped to think about what freedom truly meant. Was it just about escaping captivity, or was it something deeper, something more elusive? Could freedom really be found in the wilderness, in the survival of each day, or was there more to it? As they continued to make their way through the storm, Will realized that he had been asking the wrong questions. It wasn't about chasing the next bounty or the next job. It was about finding something worth living for, something worth fighting for. The Cheyenne woman had already understood that in her own way. She had learned to accept what had happened to her, to find a kind of peace in the midst of chaos. She had embraced the struggle, the hardship, because it was the only way to survive. They had stopped for the night, setting up camp in the shelter of a small grove of trees. The fire crackled as they huddled close to it, the warmth a welcome relief from the freezing cold. Will had never been one to make small talk, but tonight he felt an urge to speak. The silence between them was heavy, and he couldn't bear it any longer. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. The woman looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. She didn't answer immediately, but her gaze seemed to soften, as if she were considering the question carefully. "What comes next?" she asked, her voice calm, as though she had heard the same question many times before. "What comes next is the same thing that comes before. Survival. We live, we endure, and we move forward. There is no end to the journey, only the next step." Will felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had always been focused on the end, on the moment when the job was done, when the bounty was claimed, when the reward was his. But this woman, this captive, had shown him that there was more to life than just the end. There was the journey itself, the small moments that made up the larger picture. He realized then that he had spent his life chasing something he couldn't define, something that was always just out of reach. The wind blew harder and the fire flickered, sending sparks into the air. Will reached for his coat and pulled it tighter around his shoulders, trying to block out the cold. His mind raced, but his thoughts felt scattered. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next, but he knew one thing for certain. He didn't want to go back to the way things had been. He glanced at the woman who was sitting across from him, her face partially illuminated by the fire. She didn't look at him, but he could feel the weight of her presence. She was waiting, as always, calm and steady. Will didn't know how to explain it, but there was something in the way she held herself, in the way she accepted the world around her, that made him realize how much he had yet to learn. "How do you do it?" Will asked, his voice rough. "How do you keep going day after day with nothing to hold on to?" The woman's eyes met his, and for the first time there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't the calm acceptance that he had seen before. There was a quiet strength in her, a fire that was hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be seen. "We keep going because there is nothing else," she said softly. "There is no choice but to survive. And as long as we are alive, there is always hope, even if it is small." Will stared at her, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had always thought of survival as something brutal, something harsh. But now, in the flickering firelight, he saw it differently. Survival wasn't just about fighting against the world. It was about finding the strength to endure, to move forward, even when everything seemed hopeless. That night, as they lay under the stars, Will couldn't sleep. His mind was too restless, too full of questions he didn't have answers to. He thought about his past, about the choices he had made, and about the path he had chosen. He had lived a life of survival, of chasing rewards and running from the consequences of his actions. But now he wasn't sure if that was enough anymore. The Cheyenne woman had shown him a different way of thinking, a different way of living. She had found a kind of peace in the midst of everything, something that Will had never known. And as he lay there, staring up at the stars, he realized that perhaps it was time for him to find that peace too. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was clear and the air was cold, but still. Will and the woman packed up their camp and prepared to continue their journey toward Fort Laramie. Will didn't know what would happen when they got there, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to rush. He had come to a crossroads in his life, and he didn't have all the answers. But he knew one thing. The journey was far from over. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to face it, no matter what came next. And in that moment, Will Graves understood that the greatest reward was not in the bounty he collected, but in the strength to survive and the wisdom to move forward, no matter where the road took him.